Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Jennifer Dow, a homeschooling mother, classical teacher, speaker, and consultant. Jennifer is a CERCI certified classical teacher, and she's taught nature study, humanities, logic, rhetoric, and the fine arts since 2009. She founded Paideia Fellowship and currently serves as the executive director and lead trainer. Jennifer, an Orthodox Christian, lives in North Carolina, a fellow North Carolinian, with her 3 children, and she enjoys spoken word poetry, trying her hand at fancy cuisine, collecting more books than she'll ever read, as any good reader does. She enjoys a lovely saunter through the woods and the occasional Netflix binge. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you could start just by telling us a little bit about yourself and your family and how you came to start homeschooling.
Yeah, sure. So, well, let's see which direction to go. I have been homeschooling. I started homeschooling in 2009. I never expected to homeschool. It actually happened. I was taking some classes at the local seminary, and I know it's going to sound a little bad when I tell the story, but God definitely used it for me to be like, wake up. I was starting to learn that there are thoughts behind our thoughts, and there are thoughts behind the ideas we present in science and history and literature, and that reality was, I was waking up to the reality of that. And so naturally I was thinking, well, I wonder what my kids are learning, really learning in school. I wonder what, ideas and philosophies and patterns of thought that are just coming to them almost passively. And I wonder if the teachers are even aware of the fact that they're teaching these things. And so those questions led me to ask some questions in my seminary class. And this guy after class was like, I just want you to know that it is God's will that you homeschool. He was very direct, very serious about it. And while I don't believe that it is a sin to not homeschool, I definitely don't believe that. There's definitely different seasons and different people needing different things. That message was for me. It was true for me at that time. And it was something that I believe God was calling me to. And so that kind of launched me into my journey homeschooling. I didn't know anything about education other than what my mom had taught me because she was a teacher. So all I did was I did 2 things to figure out how to start homeschooling. Is I downloaded the North Carolina state standards and made a checklist. And then when I realized how overwhelming that was, I took a quiz in Mary Pride's Guide to Homeschooling, and it said I should be a classical teacher. So then I bought classical books. And that is how I started out. I know I was going to be very two extremes, but that was my entry point.
Oh my goodness, that is hysterical. But I love that too, because I think so many times people think, especially with classical education, it comes from this, I am profoundly thinking about these ideas and I shall go forth into classical education. And sometimes our entry point to it is just all sorts of different ways.
I took a quiz.
So you took the quiz and you were like, okay, we're going to move on from here. But, over the years, obviously your understanding of home education and educational philosophy has grown and developed. So how have you kind of seen that change and progress over the years?
Yeah, great question. So a lot, a lot. Before I had started homeschooling, I did take a communications class and was instructed to read a book called How to Speak, How to Listen. And in that, it was by Mortimer Adler. And in that book, he was talking about the liberal arts. And I remember feeling very jealous that I had not received that education. And I think that must have subconsciously informed my decision to go with classical education after the quiz. But then after that, I got into the most well-known book was, of course, Well-Trained Mind. And so I bought that and started doing that in the first year. We did it on our own. After that, we joined Classical Conversations, did that for a few years. And in the midst of that, that's where I was introduced to the CERCI apprenticeship. And that, I would say, is probably the biggest turning point for me in my pursuit of classical education. It was then that I knew that whether I was homeschooling my kids or not, that I always had to be a part of classical education. Like it changed me so much. I really received my classical education in the apprenticeship. I not only did I learn how to teach, I learned how to think about education. I learned how to be a classical teacher in a lot of ways. I became a better mother and friend and human being. Like it affected every single area of my life. And I woke up to the reality and the power of a truly humane classical liberal arts education. I also encountered Charlotte Mason when I was in the apprenticeship. A lot of people were reading her, and I'm like, well, who is this person? And so I started reading her and exploring the intersection of the liberal arts and Charlotte Mason. And meanwhile, teaching more and more classes, not just in my own homeschool, but not having access to CC anymore. I'm like, okay, what are we going to do? And so we started something, and we didn't expect it to grow. We just expected to go back to CC, but then all of a sudden we were meeting a need, and we're like, I kind of like this a lot. And so we started the 1 day a week homeschool community, and just more and more classes, and every year getting deeper into the nuances of what is this thing that I'm teaching? Who are these children that are sitting before me? And how do we pursue truth, goodness, and beauty, and hold all the particulars and tension with all of this goodness? And every year it's those two paths, going deeper and deeper, mastering the particulars and the mechanism of teaching and the plans, but also going deeper into the heart of what this is and what it really is leading us to. Every year, deeper and deeper.
I love what you just said and your expression of your own education that you are receiving. Because when I think about classical education and why, a Christian classical education is so important to me and my family, it's for that very reason. I think about what kind of human do I want to raise, right? It's not about just filling my children with a bunch of facts or, making sure they've checked off a certain book list, but it's really thinking about that whole person. And even you mentioned like relationships and friendships, education is just beyond just this small, narrow thing that we sometimes think of it. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so thankful for the homeschool education I received. I'm a second generation homeschool mom. And sometimes I say that I was classically educated before it was cool because like that was basically what my mom did. Just no one was calling it that at the time. And when I was later on in my teens, I suddenly realized that I knew all the things. And I could look and say, oh, wow, you're really going to be this new thing called classical educator. I have made sure I memorized all these lists and things, and I didn't do that, but I shall do it with my children. Right. It's so ridiculous, like thinking back on that now. And of course, you're humbled and you have to learn all the things you don't know. And coming now in my mid-30s, realizing actually what my mom was doing is pretty much actually real classical education. So anyway, it's just kind of funny to think about.
We all have to go through that.
Yes.
And teenagers are going through that right now, and I'm just trying not to cringe too much. I'm like, oh, bless your heart. Yes. Yes.
Yes. The Lord will sanctify you as well. It's all good. Well, Jennifer, as you've grown as a homeschool mom and educator, I would love to hear if there's anything about classical education, maybe a joy that has surprised you, or maybe a challenge that you weren't expecting about classical education that has come in front of you, whether you were ready or not.
So the challenge that first came to my mind, I'm sure I would think of other ones given more time, but the first one that comes to mind is when I was reading Cheryl Swope's book, Classical Education for Simply Classical, where she's writing about classical education for kids with special needs. And I have one kid who's a little like has trouble with attention, but my kids don't have real like intense special needs like her children did. But I was very interested in the book because I heard somebody say one of the best 10 books in like 50 years about classical education. So, or most important books related to classical education. So of course I wanted to read it. But the whole first section of the book is her story about herself as an educator and how she thought through and wrestled through discovering what her kids needed. And it hit me so hard, because what I realized, and I think we each probably have a tendency on one side or the other as humans to either be over the top strict with ourselves or really lax with ourselves. I tend towards the Bilbo side of things, and I'm a little like, can we just have our tea in front of the earth and that's all that's necessary? And while that's wonderful, I had to face the fact that if I'm going to be serious about my craft as teaching, then I get to cultivate that craft and take that seriously. And until that moment, I had never seen myself as a teacher. I was just, oh, I'm just a homeschool mom. I'm just a homeschool mom. I just going to do this thing and, we'll be fine. Like, I have everything I need. It was so dignifying to see myself as a legitimate educator. Before then, I had, when I first found out I was going to homeschool and decided to make that choice, my mom was really hard on me. We're great now, but there was a lot of hard conversations. And and I started to get a lot of flack from people who had teaching degrees. And if I was honest, there was a part of me that wondered if I really should be doing this. And when I read that book, what I realized is absolutely I can be doing this. The other side of that is there is a definite responsibility to cultivating my craft as a teacher if I'm going to do this. And I get to decide and make that choice. But when I read that, it opened up for me what a master teacher looked like. And I wanted that. And I loved it. And it was beautiful. And I wanted to have that discipline and focus and commitment to my students, to my children. And so it gave me a vision. So it was like a punch in the gut, a little bit like, hey, you're kind of like making this not as big of a deal as it is, but also you can definitely do this. And here's a path forward. And here's a vision, right? For the first time, it gave me a real vision of what a teacher looks like and what I could achieve. So that, I feel like that answered both questions.
Yeah, definitely. I have actually not read that book, but I'm like going to go put it on my wish list on Amazon right now. That sounds amazing. And I really appreciate too, just the reminder that we need to continue our professional development as homeschool moms. I think it's important for us to remember that we can do this. There can be sort of this artificiality of the expert, like, how could you do this? You're not an expert. And we need to combat that, but we can tend sometimes the other direction too and forget this is something to take seriously. And if we want to do a good job, that requires work on our part as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is so important. Like there's not magic fairy dust that comes when you get a teaching certificate. Like, that doesn't exist. It's a skill set. Teaching is a skill set that we can learn if we want to.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to have like a million conversations with you. I have all these different topics, and we'll just have to, have you back on here. But for today, for this middle section, I want to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is poetry. And when I was planning season 3 of the podcast, I was actually shocked that it hadn't really come up as a main topic for a podcast episode yet, because it's very important and central in my own homeschool and in the work I do with humility and doxology. So let's start kind of with a big picture and talk about what even do we mean by poetry, and then why is poetry an important part of a classical education?
Yeah. So I am really excited about this topic as well. And I'm just going to preface this with, I am not like the poetry teacher who knows all the particular things. I'm more like, I love poetry and it's changed my life. And I'm going to talk about the entry points and how it's done that. So just disclaimer as we talk. But when I think about what poetry is, the first thing that comes to mind is to compare it to literature. like from a practical sense, like just giving ourselves the right category. One way that I teach my students to see the distinction between, a novel and a play and poetry is that I see poetry as zeroing in on a moment, whereas literature or novel is more of like a whole world. And by zeroing in on the moment, a lot can open up. I kind of see it like if you look at something under the microscope, how you can see so many more details and see it from a completely different perspective. It opens up for you. Or even the way that light moves through a prism and then the light scatters and you see all the light that was contained within the one light. Poetry is like that. It opens things up and shows us all the colors. Whereas if we were to just experience the moment not so mindfully, it would have just felt like normal light.
Yeah. That is a beautiful description. I've never thought of poetry in that way. Well, a lot of times people will say like, oh, I just don't really like poetry, or even they hate poetry. And I've wondered if sometimes that's because their experience with poetry was limited to a lot of hyper-analysis of the rhyme scheme and the meter and like
Right.
the imagery, which are all important things. So I guess I want to kind of ask a twofold question. One is, how do we read poetry where we're thinking about the nuance and we're thinking about the actual techniques that the poet is using? So we're thinking about the craft of the poem, but without just breaking it down into its pieces and kind of losing the whole. And then how do we teach our students to approach poetry in that same way?
Yeah. So there's, I think, a lot in that question. I think yes. My personal opinion, I think there's multiple reasons why people, when they say they hate poetry or they don't like poetry, I think there's multiple reasons for that. When they've had an encounter with poetry in the past, it's been a very analytical, unenchanted or disenchanted encounter with it. So that's definitely one reason. I think another reason that often isn't discussed is that the mode of being that it takes to enter into a poem is not necessarily comfortable for everyone. So one of the ideas that makes a classical education what it is, it's like in my opinion, the foundational idea. David Hicks talks about it in his book, Norms and Nobility, in chapter 1. He says, the classical spirit of inquiry is what's central to what makes classical education what it is. And that classical spirit of inquiry has 3 parts. General curiosity first. Second, an openness to all the questions. Like you can just form, he uses the term imaginative hypotheses. So all the questions, all the wonderings about anything, it's all on the table. And third, basically creative method in testing them. So when you're exploring this question or that, you could discover insight and answers in a religious experience, in a poem, in a science experiment, in a work of literature, while walking through the woods. Like all of these things are valid ways of inquiring, entering into, discovering answers and insights into your questions. All of that begins though, and this threads all the way through, curiosity. Curiosity is interesting because I've noticed with homeschool moms, with all teachers, with all humans, some people seem to be curious, just like they want to know everything, and other people are almost adverse to it. Like, don't ask questions. Like it's very, and where does that come from? That probably is, a whole nother discussion. But I think this question of curiosity has to be discussed first. Because curiosity is a form of surrender. Curiosity makes a lot of, I guess, proclamations about a thing without making them. If I'm curious about something, I'm open to it, which is a form of surrender. I'm giving myself to this thing. If I'm curious about something, I feel like it's worth knowing about. So there's that. If I'm curious about something, I am excited and energized by the discovery of something about it. Like there's this It's dignity and surrender and excitement and possibility all mixed up together, applied to one thing. That is very difficult for some people. It can, and I, and I've even experienced things in my life where I'm not curious about them. Sometimes it's just because it didn't occur to me and I'm not slowing down enough to be mindful. Other times it could be because it doesn't feel safe. Like, I don't want to be wrong. Like, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask this question, or if I ask this question or say my thought, will people judge me? Or, maybe you were brought up in a classroom where you were shamed for asking questions. There's a vast number of reasons why somebody could have an aversion to curiosity. But I think when we do that, it is very difficult to enter into a poem, because that is the way of being that is required to enter in and enjoy it and to experience it. And so, so outside of that, depending on their experience, that may have affected it. But I think that might have a bigger impact on whether somebody really enjoys poetry or not. Because what are we talking about here? If it's true that a poem is a moment, like, who's going to take the time to think about a moment? Like, you have to have a certain mindset and way of being, and to be willing to go there. So I think that's part of the conversation. I think it's probably the biggest part of the conversation, and it's not anyone's individual fault. Like, I don't think there should be any shame about that. We're given in educational environments where it's not okay to explore. It's not okay to just rest in something. And we're not given environments where we can just settle in and think about it. And if we don't have that, it's really hard to really talk about a poem, because it's a moment. It's a moment that's stretched out and made wide and made to see all its colors. And if we don't think, if we have a tendency to reduce things, so the more analytical of us, there are some of us that are just more naturally analytical, which is fine. We need these people. We all have different skill sets. It's we'll be less likely to enter in, because it's easier to see life as an equation. 2 + 2 is 4. So I think it has a lot to do with ways of being and what we have a tendency towards. But I think if you find yourself in one of those spaces, like that tends to be your vibe. Poetry is always an invitation to explore a world that you have yet to explore. And it's always an invitation. Nobody's making you go there, but it is an invitation. So, and it's worth it. I mean, it's quite beautiful.
Oh, yes, indeed. And your talk about curiosity and wonder, which, I always think about is linked to humility and doxology. But I think about how you can't take yourself too seriously when you're reading a poem. You can take the poem seriously, but you can't really take yourself too seriously, or you're not going to be able to fully enter in to the poet and to that moment and to what's happening, to be willing to listen in a new way and to see in a new way. So I think that humility is really linked up with wonder. You can't have one without the other.
What do you mean? Like, what would it look like to take yourself too seriously? Like, what do you mean by that? I love that.
I think that, especially when I'm thinking about with a poem, is if you come to the poem as a puzzle to be solved, that you are kind of setting yourself over the poem. And instead of coming with openness to listen to what the poem is saying, or to be willing to be challenged to think about that moment or that idea or that emotion and that thought in a new way. But instead, if you kind of come, okay, I'm going to break you down and I'm going to figure out the answers to the questions you're asking. And if I can't figure out the answer to the question, well, then there's something wrong with the poem. As opposed to maybe there's something that I'm not ready to think about, or maybe something that I don't know. I think sometimes it's hard for some of us to just say there's something we don't know or can't fully understand yet. Not that we may not ever understand it. But that can be a scary place to be, to say, I don't understand what this is saying, and so I'm not even going to try or give it a moment. It must be a problem with the poem, not with me.
Right. Oh, I love that. I love the distinction you made, that taking yourself too seriously is putting this pressure on yourself to have to figure it out. Like, that was the whole point anyway, or something, which it wasn't. But we do that to ourselves. I know I do that to myself
all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we then, like, this is like a big idea, but then we're just sitting with our kids, you know, and I guess it'll be different if you're sitting with your little kids versus your slightly older children, and you just have a poem and you're in the living room. Like, what does this look like? We're not necessarily sitting here with our children saying, and now, children, let us approach this with wonder and humility, opening ourselves to curiosity. You know, how do we just like do the poem in the living room?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is, and this was um if you want to hear somebody else talk about poetry that much more skilled than I am and has way more experience than me, Christine Perrin, she is incredible. I would just like to sit at her feet like all the time and just tell me more about poetry. I love the way she talks about poetry. But one of the things she said is just read it multiple times. Like, let it flow through your mind, let your ear hear it, let it roll off your tongue. So one of the things that I'll do in my classes and at home is we just read it a minimum of 3 times. And we take turns depending on the reader. Now, if they're a new reader, then it's better to just let the more skilled readers say it out loud. But just say it out loud at least 3 times. And if there's even recordings, have a couple other people say it, because it's really great when you can have more than one person say it, because reading aloud is also interpretation. Whenever we read something, we're interpreting it by the way we say the sounds and and the cadence we give to it and the emphasis we give to it. It's a form of interpretation. That's why in some church traditions they won't read the Bible, they'll sing it, because then it takes the individual's interpretation out of it and allows just the words of the scripture to like come through. I always found that fascinating. But yeah, so first just reading it. And there's one of my favorite books is called Approaching Poetry. It kind of presents like a textbook, but when you actually read it, it's really good. I really enjoy it. My favorite thing is how the authors talk about entry points. One of the things that I have noticed in the classical education world is a serious attachment to one way of reading or another way of reading, as though everything is not harmonious. Now, there are some things that aren't in harmony, but as I've been exploring this, one of the things I've noticed is that rather than only one way being right, I'm seeing that these are different entry points that allow us into a text, allow us into a poem, allow us into, to enter a work of literature. Now, not everything is an entry point. Some of it is just our own mind about a thing. But there's a lot more. And so with poetry, you have a ton of different entry points. You have the words themselves. What do the words mean? You have the sounds, you have the rhythm, you have the music, you have the imagery and the symbols. You have all these different things that make a poem what it is, and they're all different entry points. And because the poem doesn't exist without all of them, then each is valid way to discover and play with really young kids. Okay, so here's an example, right? This is an example of a 6th grader. I guess she's not really young, but she's my youngest, so that's my my most current reality. She got to pick the poet that we were going to study this year, or for the first term. So she decided on Robert Louis Stevenson. And so one of the things that we did is, of course, we just read it 3 times. And then as we were talking about it, I just asked her, and I always use these 3 questions with everything, like they're gold. I got them from John Muir Laws, and he uses them when teaching about nature study. And it's, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And what does it remind you of? These 3 questions can be used to study everything. Like, if you can't figure out what to do, read something slowly and attentively and then ask those 3 questions. Like, that is the foundation and launching point for everything. It cultivates attention. It cultivates curiosity. It causes you to go back to the experience rather than your own mind, because you're asking questions about the text, about the words, about the, so what do you notice? So, it sounds like, oh, I noticed that in this particular poem was about a boy, two different worlds, a boy playing in his yard, and then reading a book about a boy playing. And so there was this comparison of these two worlds and where the book took him. And so she was noticing all these things. And then I asked this question. I asked, so if this was a painting, what would it look like? And she came up with some really cool ideas. And she's like, I imagine there was a mountain in the middle, and that there was a house on this side and a house on this side, and they both were playing and at the same time. It was just beautiful the way that she described it. And what was cool is when she began describing what the painting would look like, she said so much more about the poem than when she was trying to answer specific questions. And then through imagining the painting more about it and this boy's life or that boy's life, and it was beautiful. So that's one way that we've approached it. So one example.
Yeah, I love that. Robert Louis Stevenson is one of our family's favorites. One of my favorite moments happened, I guess this was maybe last year, with my then 7-year-old, and we were at a playground playing, and she just gotten like a little bit overstimulated and just was having a little bit of trouble. And she comes over to me on the bench and she says, Mom, I just need to recite my shadow to you because it always makes me feel better. And so she just recited my shadow with great gusto. And then she felt better, and she went back to playing, and she was fine. And I think, how you connect with a poem, and I'm not sure what it was about that poem in particular that was speaking to her in that moment.
Right.
But yeah, sometimes you don't even realize the connections that kids are making.
Yeah, I love that, because what it brings up for me is how poetry really names things that are hard to name at times. Like, so much of the human experience is an immaterial experience, and things that are hard to put words to. Not all of us find it easy to name our emotions. I am one of them. Like, I have to think a lot. I don't know if you're like an Enneagram fan. I'm a 7. And I stay in my head, whether that has anything to do with a 7 or not. I know that as a person, I stay in my head. And it takes a lot of effort for me to move out of my head into my heart. And poetry helps me do that, because it's a heart-centered experience with the world rather than a head-centered experience. It requires me to animate more of my being in encountering it. And so it's very healing for me in that way.
Well, should we just be reading like classic poems, important poems, quote unquote, or is it okay to read silly poems or modern poems?
Yeah, I definitely have a very strong opinion about this. But I think that we need to be reading all kinds of poetry. I think, so one of my favorite pastimes, like when I go and do something just for me, I often go to spoken word and poetry slams, which is a very different form than what you would see in most classical schools. One of the things, and so I'm just going to talk about that form for a minute to describe why I think moving outside of the typical classical canon is really powerful. So for example, with a sonnet is a sonnet, but you have very particular rules for the lines, and this is with a lot of the poems. Of course, you have free verse and that sort of thing as well. One of the things I've loved about spoken word poetry is that in that form, that you don't have it unless you have an audience. And so, yes, a poet usually writes a poem when they're with themselves, but there's something about getting on the stage, being with the audience, that is a sort of alchemy, not just for the poet themselves and for the entire audience. It is a space of communal healing and a place where you can get free on the mic. Like, it's incredible. Now, if you've never really gotten into it, and you're going to go look up some spoken word poems, they do generally have stronger themes, often stronger language. And so be prepared for that. But it has been so powerful to experience that of the community around words, where it's okay to just say it all. And so it's a different kind of form, but it is a form, and it has its own rules, and it has its own way that is important in the way that you show up in it. And it brings something of value that we don't experience when we're just dealing with, very the page poems. So in the spoken word world, they would call sonnets and lyrics and that sort of thing page poems. They're written for the page versus spoken word poetry. And so you have an entirely different experience. And just like with page poets, there's a variety of poets who are some, well, awesome, and some not so awesome. You have the same thing in the spoken word world. Some are outstanding, and others are just learning, But that's the other cool thing, is everyone shares the same stage and gets to grow and experience and evolve as a poet and a human. It's kind of like a sort of, I don't know how else to describe it except for this communal education, this communal healing. There's really a space for it. It feels good to get on the mic, and just leave it all there, and nobody's judging you either. It's beautiful. So I think so that's an example of one form that I think is really important and a great outlet for some people. I think another thing is the whole point of education, as C.S. Lewis talks about this in the Four Loves, in the section Affections, is that we get beyond our own, step out, enlarge our world. And if we're only sticking to things that are in our own small world, we're just going to keep repeating ourselves back to us. And education is meant to expand our world, which means stepping outside of our culture, which means stepping outside of our small thing. Sometimes that means going back to the ancients. That's why many of us value the ancients. But I also think there's value in exploring what is modern. Especially poets who've been able to put words to modern problems. People like, we're in a very unique time in our history. We have all these, well, it's not that unique. It's unique in some ways, but these are similar problems. But we have poets and artists putting words to things in ways that they haven't before. Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes, and the social justice issues, and to powerful. There's this, and he's a theologian. There's a lot of people who don't. He's a controversial theologian, and I don't really understand all of what he writes about. But the one book I have of his has to do with the priest as poet, and this function that the poet has in a community as a sort of priestly role. And I love that because I found that to be true. And so I think modern poets especially give us an opportunity to see the situations that we're currently living in our society in a way we couldn't have seen them otherwise. So have you heard of the proverb, or it's a proverb story about the elephant and the 8 or 10 blind men, where everyone's touching a different part, and so they're arguing about what it is. Well, a poet has this ability to show us different parts if we're willing to enter into the experience, different aspects of it. And so, yeah, I think it's powerful. And I'm also not one of those people that think only good stuff is old stuff. Some of the poets today will be classical, they'll be classics. And even if they're not, they're a human being. Is it true that each human is made in the image of God, or isn't it? And so I am of the mindset that if I'm beholding something the image of God made, there's something, quite possibly, that I can glean from it. Now, obviously, there's some that are, more radiating with truth, goodness, and beauty than others. But to just say, no, none of that, because whatever, just to shut it down without giving it a fair chance, I'm not a fan of. I've only been blessed by, buy it. Sure, I've read some really bad poems and been like, okay, whatever. But then, oh my gosh, I've experienced so many wonderful poems I would have never learned had I allowed my prejudices to get in the way of exploring more.
And doesn't that go back to what we were saying earlier about wonder and curiosity and humility and listening?
Right.
So it kind of all
Yeah.
relates together. Yeah.
Yeah. And I get it though, because I think a part of that, I think this might be another thing that causes us, that prevents the curiosity, since you brought it up, is fear. Like, especially, and I've noticed this with some of the moms that, you know, I've homeschooled with and led, is this fear that unless I'm doing the form perfectly, that I'm sinning somehow. Like, there's just, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect. And I'm just done with that, because I did that for a long time and it's exhausting. And living, you know, Jesus did not die on the cross and raise from the dead for us to be ashamed all the time and afraid. That's stuff for the land of the dead. And I'm interested in living in the land of the living. And that's what he offers us. And if it's true that the Holy Spirit guides us into all truth, then I can feel free to be curious. And if I'm butting up against something that's like, you know what, maybe not, I'm going to feel that check in my spirit. I mean, he hasn't failed me yet.
Yes. Is there a particular poem that you have really loved that you could read to us today?
Sure. Do you want me to read one that is more well known or less well known?
Either or both.
Okay. How about I read my two favorite poems then?
Yes, please do.
So the first poem I'm going to read is by Wendell Berry. You know, fangirl over here. I actually committed to reading a collection of his poems this year, and I'm reading the collection of Sabbath poems. And I one of my goals this year was to cultivate my ability to be mindful and attentive and still and embrace solitude more. And so I thought that reading his Sabbath poems would help me cultivate that. So um, I try to read one every day, but not always. But anyway, this first one is one of my favorite poems of all time. To me, it really expresses what it feels like to wrestle through something that's hard and what's waiting on the other side when we are brave enough to do so. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet. Around me like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places, where I left them, asleep like cattle. Then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings, and I hear its song. Then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. What I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song. After days of labor, mute in my consternations, I hear my song at last, and I sing it. As we sing, the day turns, the trees move. Love that. I am not a spoken word artist. I enjoy going like
It was beautiful. My kids laugh at me because I say this all the time, but it gave me goosebumps. They're like, Mom, everything gives you goosebumps.
As it should be, darling, as it should be. Okay, the second one is probably my favorite poem of all time. It is by a poet named Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and it's called Let the Light Enter. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was actually a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, and one of the first, if not the first, African-American women journalists, and she spoke on the abolitionist circuit. This poem is subtitled The Dying Words of Goethe, and I want to bring up the background to this. And I've always loved this poem, but then when I researched the background to it, I fell even more in love with it. So Goethe is a playwright, and he wrote a famous play called Faust. And there's different renditions of it, but one of the things that happens in this play is that this guy sells his soul to the devil. And like I said, there's different renditions. There's some that he is redeemed and saved from hell, and others where he's not. And it is said that Goethe, in his dying words, asked for more light. And when I was reading that, I could not help but think about the connection between Goethe and Faust, and I wondered. And it just got me wondering. And so I wonder about that connection and those ideas, and as I read this poem. So I'll go ahead and read it. Light. And my life is ebbing low. Throw the windows widely open. Light, more light before I go. Softly let the balmy sunshine play around my dying bed. Ere the dimly lighted valley, I with lonely feet must tread. Light, more light, for death is weaving shadows round my waning sight, and I fain would gaze upon him through a stream of earthly light. Not for greater gifts of genius, they bright. Oh, the dying poet whispers, is a prayer for light, more light. Heeds he not the gathered laurels, fading slowly from his sight? All the poet's aspirations center in that prayer for light. Gracious Savior, when life's daydreams melt and vanish from thy sight, may our dim and longing vision then be blessed with light, more light.
Thank you so much for sharing those with us.
My pleasure.
If you can send me the either links to those or the text, I would love to be able to have the text of that in the show notes too.
Oh yeah, absolutely, I will. Yeah.
Well, I mean, after that, I almost feel like we should just say amen and close it. But I do want to ask you these last two questions that I've been asking all my guests this season. And the first is just, what have you been reading lately?
Okay, yeah. So right now, I'm reading a ton of stuff for my high school class. But personally, I'm reading a book called Mountain of Silence, and it's about the life of the Eastern Orthodox monks, specifically in the Greek tradition, and how their spiritual regimen plays a part of their sanctification. So, like, it's so fascinating because I have always thought of monasticism and all their little, all the rules as like, at times it's felt kind of arbitrary when I heard about it. And this book is like opening up how they're actually therapeutic exercises that, lead towards somebody's healing and sanctification. And so I'm totally fascinated by it because I love that stuff. And so I'm reading that. And then in my high school class, we are in ancient Greece right now. So we're reading the Iliad, and we're reading Dorothy Mill's Book of the Ancient Greeks. And then I'm reading one called The Greek Experience to kind of inform my understanding of the Greeks at a deeper level. And it's so good. It better be, because I paid $50 for it at a used bookstore. But I am so happy with that. And then with the Iliad, the guide I chose is one called Pattern in the Iliad, another random book I found at a used bookstore, but it's amazing. He's talking about how the pattern of the Iliad is really metaphors placed in different spots and repeated. So where they're placed and where they're repeated really is what forms the form or gives shape to this epic poem. So that's a little bit of what I'm reading.
Oh, that's fascinating. The Iliad has long been a favorite of mine. So I'll have to add that to my list. Oh my goodness, I have so many books now to add to my list after this conversation. Yeah. Oh, finally, if you were talking to a homeschool mom, what tip would you give, or what strategies would you give her for that day that just seems to be going completely off the rails?
Yeah, I would say that remember I think it's Isaiah 54, where that verse where God says, "And I myself will teach your children." I've constantly been amazed, and we've been through a lot of tragedy in our home in the last 3 years, how much that is true. That even when everything is going crazy, that my children learn in spite of me and my capacity, but how much that God really does love them more than I even can, like every single time. And if I'm willing to surrender to that and follow his urging wherever it leads, even if it's something that I'd rather not do, then we'll be okay.
Such an important place to put our hope as a homeschool mom. So important.
Yeah.
Well, Jennifer, where can people find you all around the internet?
Yeah, so you can find me at Paideia Fellowship. That's PAIDEIA.com. And we have a blog there. And also we have now an ongoing classical homeschool mom coaching program. So it's like a living apprenticeship by homeschool teachers for homeschool teachers. And we're having so much fun with that. And then, of course, on social media at either Jennifer R. Dow or Paideia Fellowship.
Fabulous. And I will have links to those things, your site and social media and the coaching program in the show notes for this episode at humilityanddoxology.com. Thank you again so much for taking time to chat with me today. This has been a real treat.
Oh, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.